So thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Invasives in the Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area, Current Status and Future Directions. The Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area covers 11,546 square kilometers of entirely marine environment located off the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Invasive species such as rodents, mustelids, and raccoons are one of the most pressing threats to the millions of seabirds that breed on the Scott Islands. In this webinar, David will summarize the current status of seabird populations on the Scott Islands, the invasive species present on the islands, and the efforts underway to prevent future spread of invasive mammals to the Scott Islands. I am pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to David Bradley. David is the Director of BC Office for Birds Canada, where he manages various outreach and citizen science projects. He is particularly involved in several invasive species projects in the Haida Gwaii, the North Coast, and the Scott Islands. At this point, I will pass the mic over to you, David, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
That's great. Thank you, Caitlin. I'll start my presentation now. Okay, do you see the first slide?
Yeah, it looks great, David. If you could just put it into presentation mode. Perfect. That looks awesome.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Caitlin. I appreciate it. I am calling you from the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, which is a place I call Surrey, British Columbia. And I'm going to talk to you today about the invasive alien species in the Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area, as you probably know. This lovely image on the front screen is a place called Puffin Rock. And I'll tell you a bit about that later on in the seabirds that breed there. But I just want to point out now, if you can follow my mark here, the path that goes up snakes its way up the front of this rock all the way up to the top and over the top there. And it's very high. It takes nearly an hour to climb up there. And on the top is like a plateau that has many thousands of breeding seabirds. Just an amazing place to go. So as was mentioned, I'm the director of the British Columbia Office of Birds Canada. We're a national bird conservation organization. And one of the things that we're very concerned about is alien invasive species. We know that globally, oceanic islands have seen 74% of known bird extinctions, the vast majority of which have been caused by introduced species, which is a shocking number. And since 1500, 71 bird species have gone extinct for this reason. And hundreds of populations of other species have also been extirpated. Of course, it's not just birds. We highlight birds because we're a bird-focused organization, and that's our primary mandate. But more than 40% of IUCN red-listed species are also found on oceanic islands, and many of those are threatened by invasive species. The greatest impact invasive species are found on islands because many of the island species have evolved in predator-free environments. They basically don't have the necessary defenses against predators, especially land-based predators. And the Pacific is really the epicenter of this issue, with 42 bird species on the brink of extinction and many more becoming threatened every single year. And this image, the map really shows where the highlighted spots are with the most pressing invasive species concerns. And you can see the Hawaiian Islands, New Zealand, and some of the Southeast Asian islands in Indonesia, for example, are really hotspots for this threat. And as you know from Dan Tompkins' presentation at the invasive meeting 2021 back in February, New Zealand has been threatened by invasive mammals, especially for many years, and they've come with an innovative new method to try and tackle that with their pest-free by 2050 plan. So that really is a good lesson, I think, in invasive species management on ocean islands, and really is one of the leading lights that we use to put a lot of the work that we're doing with Birds Canada on the coast of Canada. So as you probably know, the islands off the coast of British Columbia are really hotspots for seabird populations. This is no surprise. As we know, the islands of Haida Gwaii have a very great number of seabirds breeding there, as do the islands off the coast of Vancouver Island and the Central Coast. And this map really highlights the main seabird breeding colonies. This is a map produced by the Seabird Colonies of British Columbia, produced a few years ago. And it highlights the main species as well. So we know rhinoceros orchids are very prevalent on these islands. And really, I've highlighted the the box there for rhinoceros auklet being 60% of the Canadian population of rhinoceros auklets. Sorry, the world population of rhinoceros auklets breed on the BC coast. 40% of the world's population of ancient murrelets breed on the BC coast, and 54% of the world's Cassin's auklet population breeds on the BC coast. So we have a shared responsibility to reconserve these birds in British Columbia. And I've also put asterisks for ancient murrelet and Cassin's auklets because these two species are listed under Species of Risk Act as special concern. Essentially, they are threatened quite a bit by mainly invasive species. I've also put on there Leach's storm petrel with 2 asterisks because that is a threatened species. At least the Atlantic populations. The Pacific population has yet to be assessed, but it could very well be as threatened as the Eastern Atlantic population. There's also a huge population of fork-tailed storm petrels on the BC coast, which is also burrow nesting seabirds. So all 5 of these birds are burrow nesting seabirds, and they live most of their the breeding season is their young are hatched in the burrows, and so they're quite susceptible to alien invasive predators, especially mammals. And the area I'm going to be talking about today is Triangle Island, so the Scott Island in general, Triangle Island in particular, which is off the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. And you may have heard it before because of its prowess in terms of seabird breeding numbers. And if we focus in a little bit, the Scott Island's Marine National Wildlife Area was first protected under the Canada Wildlife Act in 2018. It was the first marine national wildlife area to be designated in this way. Normally it's a terrestrial designation that's given national wildlife areas. And before I get criticized for not capitalizing the word marine in that title, it's intentionally lowercase because the name, they didn't want the National Wildlife Area or NWA acronym to be diminished by calling it an MNWA. So that's why it's Scott Island's Marine National Wildlife Area. And this was designated, as Caitlin said, to protect 11,500 square kilometers of marine environment surrounding the 5 main Scott Islands, which are there on the image. And these islands are all protected historically by the province of British Columbia as 3 ecological reserves. So Triangle Island on the furthest out, Sartine Island and Barrettsville Island further inland, and then as a provincial park, the lands in Cox Island Provincial Park, closer to Vancouver Island. So these 5 main islands and the surrounding islets and surrounding waters are now protected under federal law. The reason that it's designated such a way is because of the millions of seabirds that breed there. It supports the highest concentration of breeding seabirds on British Columbia's coast. And as I sort of highlighted before when talking about British Columbia, if we look on the Scott Islands, 50% of the world's Cassin's auklets are known to breed on Triangle Island alone. That's a phenomenal responsibility we have to protect. And 7% of the world population of rhinoceros auklets also breed on Triangle Island. So there's quite a large number of birds that are known to breed there, and they're now protected, although they've been protected traditionally by the province. The surrounding areas in which they forage as a food source is now protected nationally. It's also home to 70% of Canada's tufted puffins and 95% of Pacific Canada's common murre populations. And I've highlighted these in red because we're talking about national populations, not federal or global populations. So 70% and 95% is a phenomenal number, really. Especially common murre, it's the only main seabird common murre colony on the Pacific coast of Canada, and it's all concentrated on Triangle Island. An entire sheer rock phase of Triangle Island is covered in common murres, representing 95% of the Canadian breeding population of that species. And tufted puffins are quite interesting. That photo I showed you of Triangle Island, the grassy slopes facing the camera really have the bulk of the breeding tufted puffins there. It's an amazing island to go to because you can walk in amongst very carefully amongst all the seabird burrows as they go about their daily business. So really, because of these seabirds breeding there, this whole area has been designated Important Bird and Biodiversity Area, or IBA, by BirdLife International. Birds Canada is the one of 2 Canadian partners in the BirdLife International network. And so with great importance that we put on IBA criteria. And really it's designated this way because of the concentration of breeding seabirds, and the fact that the Scott Islands group represents the largest seabird breeding area in the North Pacific, south of Alaska. It's also the most important breeding colonies for seabirds in British Columbia, as I highlighted on the previous slide. And most interestingly, from a birdwatcher's perspective, there's 12 different breeding seabirds known to breed on the Scott Island, which is more than any other place in Canada. When I went there a few years ago, I got to see things like thick-billed murre, and the horned puffin, which don't breed anywhere else on the Pacific coast of Canada. So it's quite unique in that sense. But also it does support over 2 million breeding seabirds on those islands. So it's a phenomenal place to be. There's just birds whizzing around all the time, landing on the island and scurrying into burrows. And the noise is incredible at night. I camped on the top of Puffin Rock for a few nights, and the night sounds are just unbelievable. So as amazing as the Scott Islands are, seabirds, they are threatened by numerous things. One of the main threats is the threat of oil pollution, especially with the prevalence of oil tanker traffic on the BC coast. Fisheries, overfishing is also an issue. Also, these burrow-nesting seabirds, not all of them, most of them feed on fish, and the more we take fish from the ocean, the less there is for seabirds. And so the overfishing epidemic that's happening on our oceans these days is a major threat to seabirds. There's also a threat of disturbance to seabirds breeding on the Scott Islands. This is a land-based disturbance or boat-based disturbance as well. So approaching burrows too close can cause seabirds to abandon. So anyone who lands on the island, which you can't do without a permit, is likely to disturb seabirds. So that's a big threat to them as well. But also the ever present threat of climate change. And this picture on the bottom of the famous blob that showed up off the Pacific coast in 2015 is a recurring phenomenon now. We're seeing more and more year after year these warm water anomalies forming off the coast. And this affects seabirds in many ways. It can affect their prey source, especially those seabirds like cas and orcas that feed slightly lower down the food chain on Invasives, for example, which respond quite rapidly to warming waters. So their populations are more directly affected by climate change than some of the fish feeding seabirds. Nevertheless, these birds are threatened by climate change, and those birds breed on Scott Island, so that's one of the main threats. But of course, the main threat we're here to discuss is the consequences of animal introductions and invasive alien species. So these two images on the bottom are quite graphic, and that's why I chose them. And they really show some of the consequences that invasive mammals, especially, can cause breeding seabirds. You may have seen this picture on the right before. It's a picture of an albatross on the, I believe it's the Gough Island in the South Atlantic, or Marion Island in the South Atlantic. And these poor breeding albatrosses are being eaten alive by house mice that were introduced to those islands a number of years ago. And they'll just sit there and allow themselves to be eaten by these mice without really defending themselves at all, because these seabirds don't have any natural defenses against them. And this is a really pressing issue, and they're looking into how they can eradicate mice from Marion Island in the future. But it's a very expensive thing to do from a large island such as that. Picture on the bottom left here is a picture of a gannet or a booby of some sort being eaten by an animal which I think is an American mink, or it could be a stoat. And this is another example of being eaten, literally eaten alive by invasive alien species. So not only are these islands amazing for seabird populations, but they also have substantial mammal populations. The two sea lions, California and Stellar sea lions, as I pictured there, left and right, have large rookeries on those islands. And the smell is overwhelming. You go around to the East Beach of Triangle Island there, and there's a very large colony of Stellar sea lions. I think the largest one in Western North America. There are thousands of them there. Also, there's a hole out for northern elephant seals. The picture on the bottom left is a picture I took one night on the beach below the camp. This elephant seal showed up in the seaweed and it stayed there for about a week. We thought it was dead for a while, but it wasn't. It was just resting, I think, digesting and molting. So it was removing its outer skin. Eventually, one night, at high tide, it disappeared the next day. That's quite an interesting thing to see. And there's a large number of harvest seals, as you can see in that picture in the bottom right, and they seem to be quite present around the islands, feeding on the fish species there. There's also quite a population of sea otters there, which is unique, quite interesting in Canada, and quite a few river otters also on the island. So that's quite a few islands mammals as well. There are also a few terrestrial mammals of interest. Keen's mouse population, or deer mice, as they're also known, they're quite prevalent on the island. Interestingly, around the cabin there on Triangle Island, people have said that they're larger than Keen's mouse seen elsewhere on the BC coast. I don't know that species well enough. They certainly were large mice, and they're quite prevalent, especially around the cabin there. Also, there's a unique endemic subspecies of the Townsend's vole, known as the Triangle Island vole, which lives on Triangle Island, and that's currently recognized on the provincial list as a threatened species, or endangered species. So we know these islands are both valuable from seabird population, but also valuable from the mammal population. Essentially, it's an amazing place to go to. But unfortunately, there's quite a few alien invasive species that have found their way onto the Scott Islands. They certainly haven't found their way naturally. They've been introduced intentionally by humans in cases of mink and raccoon, which were introduced to Lands and Cox Islands in the 1930s to begin a fur industry. And this is a sort of story that we've heard again and again on many islands, oceanic islands around the world. The well-intentioned fur trade industry thinks that they can just introduce a mammal without thought about the breeding seabirds and native birds and animals that live there, and in a new environment they just take over. So they were introduced in the 1930s to Lands and Cox Islands, and they readily, especially raccoons, spread between those two islands. And since they're introduced, the seabirds breeding on those islands, which unfortunately we don't know how many there were, but by the time it was extensively surveyed in the 1980s, those seabirds had pretty much disappeared. And to this day, there's not known to be any seabirds breeding on those islands, which is a really sad story, but that's what happens when mammals are unintentionally introduced to islands. There are proposed solutions currently in the planning stage to remove raccoon and mink from Lands and Cox Islands. However, the proposed methods for doing that are controversial, because it obviously, to do this on a scale of an island scale such as this, often anticoagulant poisons are used, which is not a very friendly way to do it. So there's a public perception issue. We're currently working through that. Fortunately, Birds Canada has worked as a partnership with Coastal Conservation, the province of British Columbia, and Environment Climate Change Canada for a few years to really provide advice on this process moving forward. This whole planning process was delayed by the COVID situation, because the proposed fieldwork to at least sample the islands for seabirds and for invasive mammals prior to any eradication being done was impossible. So that was really delayed by COVID, and I think it's been delayed again. Unfortunately, the cost of removing pests from these islands is very high, and it's not guaranteed beyond the time window that's available for the governments that are planning on doing it. And obviously the money we've had to put into the COVID pandemic has reduced the available money in the coffers of the federal and provincial governments. So there's a few doubts as to how this is going to continue in the future, but we're still thinking as if it will. So hopefully this happens at least a few years down the road. So other than those two invasive species, the only other known invasive mammal on the Triangle Islands is a population of European rabbits that were introduced by the lighthouse keeper in the 1920s. So the tip of, the highest point on Triangle Island has an old lighthouse on it that was set up in the turn of the 19th century. However, they soon realized after they set it up that the amount of fog that you get there made it as a pretty useless lighthouse stations. They abandoned it. They didn't collect all the rabbits they had, unfortunately. So that meant that the rabbits are now quite widely distributed on those islands. We don't know how many there are, but the impact is thought to be not that severe, fortunately. But they're known to be well established on Triangle Island. a comparative analysis looking at Triangle Island and the nearby Sartine Island to look at the vegetation characteristics of those two islands and look whether or not rabbits have necessarily impacted the islands was not conclusive to show that rabbits have had an impact, because the effects seem to be similar on the two islands. However, we know that the rabbits are known to cause vegetation differences on islands away from British Columbia. So that population is being, the eye is being kept very closely on that species. But there's no plans to remove them currently, because they don't, at least they're not thought to cause a major threat to those breeding seabirds or mammals on those islands. Now, I've talked mainly about invasive mammals, but of course there's other species that are invasive. Aquatic invasive species are a major threat to other areas of the BC coast. Tunicates, for example, and European green crab. I don't know whether either of those two species are found around Triangle Island, for example. I suspect tunicates might have been, because of the amount of marine traffic around Triangle Island, which are known to transport tunicates between populations. European green crab I know even less about, and I'll be interested to hear from others on this call in the discussion period afterwards as to whether or not either of these marine aquatic invasive species are likely to have reached Triangle Island, for example. This picture on the bottom right shows me walking on the top of Puffin Rock, and you can see the thick salmonberry crop on the top of Triangle Island, on top of Puffin Rock. We know this is a changed environment from what it was at the beginning of the work being done on Puffin Rock. It was originally set up in the 70s as a seabird research site. And at the time when it was set up, it was dominated by tufted hairgrass that is almost completely absent from Puffin Rock now. You can see some on the bottom left picture, but on Puffin Rock, it's almost completely absent. Whether this change occurred because of the introduction of rabbits to the island is unknown, or whether it's caused by climate change issues or natural transition of plant species from one regime to another regime. It's currently not known. Interestingly, Cassin's auklet, which is one of those seabirds that breeds on Triangle Island, tends to avoid salmonberry. So it might have been a lot more widespread in the tufted hairgrass than salmonberry, the now dominant salmonberry on Puffin Rock. But of course, salmonberry is not an alien species. So although it looks to be invasive from how quickly it's spread across Triangle Island, but there's no plans to remove salmonberry from either of those islands. So how do we ensure that alien invasive species, especially alien invasive mammal species, don't get to the Scott Islands? We already know that the 3 species are prevalent on a few of the Scott Islands, and they're known to have removed or extirpated several seabird breeding colonies on the Island and Cox Islands. But how do we prevent alien invasive species from spreading? Of course, we all know that the best way to do that is through rigorous biosecurity measures. And enforcing those biosecurity measures is a critical step in the process. So a few years ago, Coastal Conservation and myself at Birds Canada started to create a biosecurity plan for lands and Cox Islands, where that photo is taken from land island looking at Cox Islands, with Beresford Island in the left-hand side of that picture. We decided to create a biosecurity plan for the Scott Islands archipelago. So we published that in 2020, and it's currently being reviewed after publication and before being put into place. Something that Birds Canada has been doing over the past year has been creating biosecurity outreach products. And that's something that I'm hoping we can have a discussion about after this presentation is complete. Because I know there's a lot of experience on the call right now with people who have used, who have created outreach products to promote biosecurity. So we've tried to create our own here, and I would very much value the opinion and experience other people have before we really put a lot of these in front of people. So they've all been produced, and they're currently sitting on our computers, and some of them printed off, and we're about to get them out to the public. The first thing we've done is produce a biosecurity checklist for the main Scott Islands with seabirds breeding on them, such as Triangle, Lance, and Cox Island. These are the most likely islands to be visited by people. They're currently protected under a permit, so you can't go there unless you have a permit. So that process ensures the province who has to give these permits ensures that people actually have this checklist in front of them and they have to follow the guidelines, and they'll be checked by a security officer before they land on the island. So we produced this biosecurity checklist that's very similar to many of the ones that are produced in other countries, such as New Zealand, in which we modeled this product. We also produced a pamphlet as a guide to vessel owners, essentially preventing vessel owners from accidentally or even intentionally transporting invasive mammals, especially rats and house mice, between the ports on the mainland and those islands off the coast, the Scott Islands. So they might unintentionally carry a rat on their boat, so preventing them from doing so was really the goal of this pamphlet. So we produced several thousand of these pamphlets, and we're going to stock them at harbour masters' offices and different boating stores and marine filling stations, for example, around the main areas that are likely to carry boats that might visit those areas around the Scott Islands. So, for example, Port Hardy, Port McNeill, and some of the smaller ports around Port Hardy, Telegraph Cove, for example. We also produced some aluminum signs to be posted around, again, those main ports where many of the vessels will be leaving, especially fishing vessels and transportation vessels. We did something similar up in Haida Gwaii with a big red sign. Now we're doing something slightly different, and we're posting these around these marinas and harbours around Port McNeill and Port Hardy in particular. We also produced a series of rat-free vessel kits. So it's basically a biosecurity kit that people can pick up for free at the harbour masters' offices at Port McNeill and Port Hardy, and also the front counter office in Port McNeill. And these kits basically consist of some snap traps for rats and for mice, and a series of instructions on how to deploy these, how to bait them, and pamphlets such as the rat-free vessel pamphlet that I showed you before. And those people who do pick it up get to take with them a sticker such as this rat-free vessel sticker to put on their boat as a way to show other boat owners and the public that they have that biosecurity kit on board and they're aware of biosecurity issues. This is not something, we're not accusing boat owners of necessarily carrying pests, but this is obviously one of the main vectors through which pests can get to islands, that we wanted to really target this audience. We also produced a guide such as this, which really is a guidelines for setting rodent traps on your vessel. So basic things on where to set your traps, how to do it, and what the general guidelines are. Also a guide on how to create your own wooden trapping tunnel. We know that rat traps are much more effective when they're inside a wooden trapping tunnel because that provides a dark space for rats to crawl into. We're not likely to provide for free the wood and the materials, but at least providing the public with instructions on how to create this is useful. So these instructions are currently on the Birds Canada website. We have a link to that website on a lot of those outreach materials. It's a QR code, so you can scan that and it automatically links them to this instruction set on creating your own wooden trapping tunnel. We also created some popular press articles over the past few months to really highlight the issue of invasive species and the wealth of birds and mammals that currently exist on the Scott Islands. A good example of this is the Birdwatch Canada magazine, which is a magazine that goes out to our membership, large membership across Canada, particularly in Canada and BC. And this is an article written by Karen Beale, who's one of our interns And she wrote this wonderful article on the seabirds breeding on Triangle Island, and the threats that invasive species pose to these breeding seabirds. We also created a BC boating blog on The Wave, which is our online boating site, again highlighting the issue of invasive species. Interestingly, when I called The Wave to propose posting this blog article on their website, the answer I got from them was they never heard of the issue of rats being a problem for birds on islands. And so this is really quite educational for the editor of the blog, as well as for the public who might read this, especially those people who are getting their boats ready for summer season. And it's a good time to target them. And that's one thing we've done with a social media plan. So we've created social media posts to send out before the boating season begins, so pretty soon. And this consists of a number of progressive posts on Twitter and Facebook to try and encourage people to follow good biosecurity procedures when going out on their boats. And lastly, we produced the Scott Islands Communications and Outreach Strategy document, which is currently sitting with BC Parks. And this document really goes through the process of how to maximize the communication messages going out to the public, and all the basic components that we produce, and how you stock those in different areas. So one thing I want to play for you now is some videos that we produced, some animated videos. Now we've produced a number of these. I'm only going to play one of them, the one that's specific to the Scott Islands. We've also produced a shorter one that's more for any island off the BC coast. And again, it's the biosecurity videos, providing people with information on how to minimize their opportunities for accidentally carrying pests to offshore islands. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and switch over to the video. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the Scott Islands Biosecurity video screen. So this runs for 4.5 minutes, so I'll play this right now.
Hi, and welcome to the Scott Islands Biosecurity video. This is the video to help you do your part to follow the guidelines laid out in the Biosecurity Plan for the Scott Islands archipelago. Lying far out in the cool and nutrient-rich Pacific Ocean off the northern tip of Vancouver Island, the 5 Scott Islands are home to the largest number of breeding seabirds in Western Canada. These islands and their surrounding marine waters are one of the most diverse marine ecosystems on Canada's Pacific coast. The Scott Islands Marine National Wildlife Area was established to conserve the marine environment around the Scott Islands, while the province of British Columbia protects the island habitat as Anne-Vallée, or Triangle Island, Sartine Island, and Bedford Island ecological reserves, and Lands and Copse Provincial Park. The Scott Islands area provides breeding and nesting habitat for 40% of BC seabirds, including 90% of Canada's tufted puffins, 95% of Pacific Canada's common murre, 50% of the world's Cassin's auklet, and 7% of the world's rhinoceros auklet. The Scott Islands are identified as an important bird and biodiversity area, or IBA, by BirdLife International, recognizing the essential habitat they can provide to Canada's bird populations, as well as the importance of the area to the conservation of bird species worldwide. The province of British Columbia has closed the ecological reserve to the public to protect the breeding birds and their nesting habitat, but scientific research for the purposes of seabird conservation is allowed through permit. The area is a seabird research hub. Information from this area provides a basis for much of the scientific knowledge about seabirds and their conservation on the Pacific coast. If invasive alien species got to Triangle Island, there's a very good chance that native species could suffer population-level impacts and go into decline. The isolated islands provide protection from land-based predators, making them an ideal place for seabirds to breed. Due to introduction by humans, invasive alien species have decimated once thriving seabird colonies on offshore islands throughout the world. The worst culprits among these invasive alien species are small mammals such as rodents, particularly rats, which feed on the eggs, chicks, and adult seabirds. The only way rats and mice can get to Scott Islands is via human transport. If they get there, somebody must have let them. To eliminate the opportunity for invasive alien species to reach the Scott Islands, you must follow the steps in this video before landing on any of the islands. First, obtain a Scott Island's Marine National Wildlife Area Biosecurity Checklist. This checklist includes all of the steps to follow prior to leaving your port of departure, whether that's a heliport or a dock. Start with, in an uncluttered, sealed and well-lit room with no sign of rodents, lay out onto the floor individually all of your gear and packs that you'll be taking onto the island. First, we'll start with your packs and bags. 1. Open and empty all of the pockets and main sections of any packs and bags, and shake them out onto the floor away from your gear. Turn any packs and bags inside out to closely inspect the inside of the bag. 2. Repack the bags carefully, closing all buckles and zippers tightly so no gaps remain that rodents could squeeze through. Equipment boxes and bags. 1. Tote bins must each be emptied and repacked, taking care not to allow rodents to remain in loose bags or material. 2. Pack all of your food items into sealed, locking, hard-sided containers, being cautious not to leave bags of food items lying around. 3. When repacked, seal the bins and hard boxes with zip ties or duct tape to ensure that the lids stay on and rodents cannot sneak in. Bedding. Check all sheets, pillows, and sleeping bags carefully for rodents. Repeat by turning them inside out. Kayaks or boats. If you're taking a small vessel onto one of the Scott Islands, carefully inspect the hold to make sure no animals are inside before departing. 2. Check for rodent signs, such as droppings or chew marks. 3. Additionally, it's a good idea to keep a couple of baited snap traps on board at all times. When you arrive in the Scott Islands, make sure to open and unpack everything inside the research station if possible, with the doors closed to ensure nothing got into your gear en route. Thank you for paying close attention and for watching the Scott Islands biosecurity video, and enjoy the spectacular Scott Islands.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the other screen. Right, so I just want to acknowledge the main funders here. So Environment Climate Change Canada and BC Parks through the license plate program, and also partnership with Coastal Conservation on this project. And I really hope we can have a discussion about this, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you in a while.
Thank you so much, David, for that great presentation and for your energy and enthusiasm on the topic. I really enjoyed it. So we have a couple questions. I'll start with the first question that's voted at the top and work my way through as time allows. If anybody has a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which is different than the chat box. And please check the list of questions. And if you see your preferred question already in the chat box, you can click the thumbs up to upvote the question. And as mentioned previously, if there's not enough time to address all the questions, there will be an opportunity to pass your question along to David. So our first question here is from Catherine, and she is wondering, how often do visitors find rodents in their gear when they visit the island?
Right, it's not a very common thing, that's for sure. At least not the Triangle Island or the Scott Islands. I suspect other islands with more visitation, it happens more often. That doesn't mean that shouldn't be paid attention to. You don't want something to happen. And really, especially if you're doing removal of pests on an island, that's the most expensive thing you can really do. And you don't want to risk that by not continuing with good biosecurity in the future. And if somebody accidentally introduces a rat to an area that you've just removed the rats from at great expense, then that's a real step backwards. So even though it's not known to happen, it hasn't happened on the Triangle, on the Scott Islands, thankfully. It is a threat because it does happen on other islands, especially larger fishing vessels, maybe with food sources kept on board, fish, for example, and regularly visiting ports. Then it's quite easy, where rats live, as we know, it's quite easy for rats to climb aboard. So these boats might not be visiting the islands, but they might be getting close enough to the islands. And as I showed on one slide there, rats are known to swim even up to a kilometer across open water. That's been shown quite clearly in New Zealand, where they actually dropped rats off and saw them swim, or they saw them move between islands at least a kilometre apart. So we've got to be very careful of that. And any rats on boats are a threat to farms.
Yeah, definitely. And also it brings to mind invasive plants as well. So the same goes for checking your gear for any plant parts or insects, because just like rats, they can easily hitch a ride and then unfortunately establish in new areas, which we definitely don't want.
Yeah, one thing I want to say is, and I should have said this earlier in the presentation, was that I'm focusing clearly on mammals being a main invasive species, but plants, of course, seeds on they are plants, and that they're a big threat. And I'm sure there are invasive or non-native plants that have been carried there on soles of people's shoes. And I know in New Zealand, obviously, that's in Australia too. They have very strict biosecurity protocols when moving between areas, New Zealand, or even arriving on the islands. And having those foot scrubbing stations to try and kill whatever what they call root rot, I think, is one of the issues. And invasive seeds, checking very carefully. We didn't really approach that because we want to target the main threat to seabirds, which is invasive mammals. Once this campaign sort of takes hold, then maybe we can focus on plant species and things like that.
Yeah, that would be great. And then our next question is from Carlo. What is the public opinion of invasive species poisoning like internationally?
Yeah, we know in New Zealand, and I use it again as an example, just because they have so much have so many problems with invasive mammals, especially, and they do use anticoagulant poisons to remove pests from many of their islands. I think in general, the public, as long as they're well educated on the subject, are in support because they realize the value in removing those pests from those islands, and they understand that the most cost-effective way of doing it is by using those anticoagulant poisons. There is obviously a portion of the public that doesn't like that, understandably, whether it's animal rights activists or whether that's people who just don't like the idea of adding poison to an environment that's been messed up by humans to begin with. That's a fair point of view. And also, the hunting lobby generally doesn't like using anticoagulant poisons, especially in New Zealand, because those obviously affect the species that they would like to hunt, and you don't want to eat meat that's been poisoned. So there are issues with using poisons, and the public generally accepts it, but there's people in the public who don't. Public education.
It's definitely a difficult topic worldwide, I think. Great. Okay, and the next question is from Sue. She says, it would be great to see a similar video for recreational boaters visiting other islands. Does anything like this exist?
It does. I don't want to picture any videos today, and I can play it now if there's time, or I can send it to you. It will be coming out on social media pretty soon. So I will definitely tag the Invasive Species Council BC on those posts. So if you follow the ISCBC Twitter tag, for example, then you will be able to see it that way.
Great. Next question is from Kelsey. She is wondering, how is enforcement mandated or kept up in these islands?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Currently, most of those islands are visited by helicopter from Port Hardy. There's a heliport. There's 2 companies that leave there because the waters are so rough around the Scott Islands that re-landing on the islands by the boat is not possible. So you fly by helicopter, and currently there's not really any strict procedure that's followed to make sure that people don't transport mammals between the heliport on Port McNeill and Triangle Island, for example. However, that checklist is a good way of starting, and I provided that checklist as well to the various helicopter companies, and that's written up in the biosecurity strategy to contact the helicopter companies to make sure that they are aware of the issues and that their own clientele follow those criteria. So the biosecurity officer is the person who's going to make sure that people follow it. So that biosecurity checklist has a bunch of things that have to be checked by the visitor, but also has to be checked by a biosecurity officer. Currently, there is no biosecurity officer for the Scott Islands. That's funding allowing, and that's going to happen. I think visitation is only done by researchers, really, and a few times film crews and things will go out to Triangle Island under permit. So having a permanent biosecurity officer just looking at that is probably not feasible. But if there's already a biologist whose side job can be a biosecurity officer, then that would be probably the smartest way to go.
Yeah, and that document is great because it's all about behavior change and getting people to understand, the risk of what they could possibly be bringing in accidentally. So just like the council, we use behavior change programs, and that's a great start when, you can't have somebody at all the trailheads making sure that people are using boot brushes. But if you can teach people the importance of doing the behavior and then they change it, that's the best way to go about it usually. We've got a couple questions about resources. So Steve is wondering if you could provide a link to the Biosecurity Plan. I'm pretty sure I saw a link quickly in the video. So I'm guessing the Biosecurity Plan and the outreach products are listed online. Is that correct?
Yeah, that link that was on the bottom of the video there should have them all there. I don't know if the Biosecurity Plan is there, but definitely the outreach products are there that you can download.
Great. And then is there also a resource? Iola is wondering if there's a copy of the tunnel rat trap design as well.
Sure, that's on there. That's on the link that was down the bottom there.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's quite a simple way of doing it. I haven't built it myself, but I'd like to try doing that. Those designs I've modified based on the Department of Conservation in New Zealand's designs. And obviously I put it together myself, but that sort of technique of putting a fence over several pieces of wood like that is a pretty standard way of making a tunnel like that for trapping tunnel. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then just one last question from Catherine, which I believe we already answered. She's just wondering who visits the Scott Islands. Are tourists allowed? I thought it was not open to visitors, only researchers, which.
Yeah, so I can't say this enough, but we do not want to encourage the public to go out there because it's not allowed. You can only go there under permit, which you have to apply through the province of British Columbia to get. A few times there are people who have landed there because of necessity, because they're recent stormy weather and they have to land there because their boat's damaged or they got in trouble somehow and they've landed on the island. However, they're quickly told to, once they're secure and safe and everything, to leave the island. You can visit Lands and Cox Island. We also don't suggest that just because it's a dangerous place to visit. The waters are very rough. People have tried to kayak out there, which is a crazy thing to do if you ask me, but they have gone out there by kayak. So that's those visitors.
Very adventurous. And then I've got a question because most of us aren't researchers and we can't access the island. What are some simple ways that citizens can, help protect the islands and help contribute to conservation?
Well, you can go there not as a researcher, but as a volunteer. If you can contact some of the Canadian Wildlife Service or Centre for Wildlife Ecology at Simon Fraser University, if you really want to go there, you can contribute that way. I think just spreading the message is probably the best way that you can maintain biosecurity protocols are followed. But also not, if you're going out on a boat, even if you think it's not, you're not going close enough to the islands to be a danger to that, making sure that your boat is rat or rodent free is an important thing to do, for sure.
That's great, thank you. And does your organization have a citizen science app that you encourage people to use?
We do actually. It's not specific to alien invasive species, and it's being still developed right now. I think they've put out a few test beta versions, but it's more for collecting bird data. So bird nesting data or bird sighting data, sort of like the eBird app. It's called Nature Counts app, and that's available on Google Play Store or iPhone Store.
Perfect, that's great. Yeah, we often encourage people to download the Report Invasives app in BC, and it's a great tool that whenever you're out, you can report an invasive species that you come across, which is really helpful. Awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions. So on behalf of the Invasive Species Council of BC and everyone listening today, thank you so much again, David, for sharing your expertise with us today. We'll be emailing all attendees a link to a short survey. Please take a moment to complete it and provide your feedback and ideas for future webinars. We also invite all invasive species researchers, practitioners, and students to submit your abstract for the 2021 Invasive Species Research Conference, taking place virtually from October 6th to 7th. You can see the link in the chat window for more information. Also, if you enjoyed this webinar, please consider supporting ISCBC's work by joining us as a member. Members are offered discounts on paid events and training courses, among other benefits. You can visit bcinvasives.ca/join to learn more. And if you live in BC and you'd like to make an impact in your community and are between the ages of 15 to 30, please consider volunteering with us. You can see the link in the chat for more information. And thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.